Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, eclectic album reviews and general musical meanderings. Welcome to part 2 of my best albums of 2023. I started with 132 albums and now we're down to just the best 10. The interesting thing that shows up to me in the second half almost always is that you start to see how my really varied tastes start to narrow. But to find that, we got to get started. So let's start off with number 10, Beauty Pill's Blue Period.
And on stage tonight, every note they play turns its back to you.
Now, as a compilation of early recordings of Beauty Pill, there's a little bit of leniency that I've allowed on this one, especially on the top 10. Once you get past the established studio recordings, there's some redundant demos at the end, and maybe some lyrics that are attention-grabbing, but maybe show the ambition of the band not quite realized to its fullest extent. But despite that, the high points of this collection really show that although Beauty Pill is a band that takes their songwriting really seriously, there's also a sense of play to their music. And the ambitious but sensitive songwriting that they have in this album really buoys the album overall to its finer points. I mean, when you open up a track with the first song being, "There's a band on stage tonight and every note they play turns its back to you." What a great lyric that really sets the stage for the whole compilation without giving away the plot. Okay, next up at number 9, I've got Lunatic Souls Through Shaded Woods. Now, Through Shaded Woods really sits at the nexus of several threads of my listening from 2023. On the one hand is a representation of the work of Maurice Duda, who's the lead singer of the band Riverside, who also released an album this year, Identity, which by all means probably should be on this top 10 on its own. But Through Shaded Woods is as good an album, I think, as Identity is, but with an entirely different approach that is framed through more Nordic folk styles. And that allows me to acknowledge my interest in Skald and Nordic music that I had kind of going on earlier this year. That had very important points of the year that were attached to that style of music. So watching Maurice Duda funnel his vision through this style's inspiration really put Through Shaded Woods at an important point, I think, in my listening that deserves recognition on this top 10. Okay, next up at number 8, I got Jantra's Synthesized Sudan. Jantra is a musician who's sort of an enigmatic legend in the area. He wanders the desert apparently, then comes back in with a synthesizer that's been specifically cracked to play like in the modes and the rhythmic styles that you'll see in Sudan. Now, because of his spontaneous nature of his music, actually getting a recording out of him is very difficult. So another thing that's interesting about this recording is it's this sort of mix of where MIDI data was downloaded from his keyboard and made into stems that were remixed with older recordings. So you really can't say exactly how authentic this recording is, but I can tell you it really captures the sort of joyous melodies that's really paint a vivid picture of what it would be to be like a party in the desert somewhere. Okay, next up I got Crownland's Fearless at number 7. Now I'm going to say a couple things about Crownlands that are going to seem like a criticism, but they're really not. They're more like an observation of trends. Because Crownlands, although they're a progressive rock group, I think that they also belong to this sort of new emerging trend that I see, which I call algorithm rock. And bands that create algorithm rock are focusing their energy on copying the style of a classic band so closely that if you're listening to, like, let's say the best of Led Zeppelin and you finally get to like the end of the playlist, the next logical step would be Greta Van Fleet. Now, Crownland does this to a degree, but with the era of Rush music between around 1974 to 1982, basically Farewell to Kings to Signals. And because of that, there's kind of like a Name That Tune Rush edition going on with this album that I really can't help playing with because I'm a huge Rush fan, which would give me reason to be very critical of them for kind of mining my favorite band for ideas. But they're so great, and what they're so good at is not just like recombining these ideas and reinventing them, but they're also really able to capture the joyous nature of Rush's work when it was at its prime. Rush was a band that, even though they were very serious, they had a real sense of an exuberance whenever it was in its prime that again, I think that Crownlands is able to kind of capture pretty well. Okay, next up at number 6, I got Colin Hay's going somewhere.
My, it's a beautiful world. I like swimming in the sea. I like to go out beyond.
Now it's that Men at Work showed up for me right around the time when I was really staking a claim around my musical identity, middle school or so. And even though that band kind of dissolved, they were always really important to me and held that place even as I've grown up. Like Business as Usual, an album that I'll always kind of go back to. But I've never really uncovered Colin Hay's solo work, and he's had a long history. He's made decades worth of solo albums, all of which have maintained pretty decent reviews from critics, but have eluded me for whatever reason. So this is the first solo album of his that I've owned, despite saying that I'm a Colin Hay fan. And it's an interesting entry point, because it is kind of a collection of a lot of his songs, several of his songs, but reworked into a more acoustic guitar setting. Now that's not my usual approach to getting into a new artist, but I think it was a good idea on this one because it's something about these arrangements being so bare bones. They're really able to capture the wistful, longing aspects of Colin Hay's voice and really showing the ground level, street level relatability of his evocative lyrics. And number 5, I've got Zenor Rubinos' Una Rosa. Una Rosa presents itself as this sort of experimental Latin art pop crossover. And as a result, this album could kind of come off as sort of stylistically disorienting. But Zenor Rubinos' beautiful voice, her confidence as a songwriter, and her convictions, like her political convictions that sort of underpin this album, really bring it together in a powerful way. I've often referred to her offhandedly as the Latin American Imogen Heap, and I still think that holds true. But I've been kind of reviewing the work of Peter Gabriel recently, and I really think that there's a crossover there too, especially during the times of Peter Gabriel's career when he was starting to play with ethnic percussion. But unlike Gabriel, Rubinos intends to speak from the perspective of a Latin American woman, and that opens up an element of protest, I think, to her music. That I think that although Peter Gabriel has put his toe in the water there, as a person who's ground level on that, Zenor Rubinos has a little bit more authority. Next up at number 4, I got Alvvays' Blue Red. Although the antics of the Gallagher brothers kind of obscured it, in the mid-90s, Oasis had a real moment. And what I really like about Blue Rev specifically is that it captures the best moments of that moment. The album crosses the streams on post-millennial guitar pop in the same way like the Jellyfish would have with Beatles and you know, psychedelic rock from the 60s and 70s. It has elements of shoegaze, it has elements of jangle pop, dream pop, and a variety of other hyphenated pop microgenres. But ultimately, it's a really great guitar rock album that has immaculately crafted songs all the way through, and also holds the distinction of being my most listened to album for 2023. Okay, next up I got Adventures of Jet, Part 3, Coping with Insignificance. So real quick backstory, if you don't know it on this one, around the year 2000, one of my favorite Dallas area bands, Bob Goblin, had to change their name due to some weird record company complications. They rebranded themselves as Adventures of Jet. Now, over 2 decades later, I think I've finally gotten over this identity shift enough to really kind of appreciate this undercover version of the band. And the only really big difference between this and Bob Goblin is that the Orwellian overtones and the sort of concept is turned down a little bit, but otherwise it's musically undistinguishable. It's still that same great angular, linear power pop that crosses like the streams between Devo and the Rentals and Elvis Costello, and it's all driven forward by like these really powerful arrangements and propelled by the vital drive of the rhythm section. And number 2, I've got Lemon Twigs' Everything Harmony. Now let me make a distinction here. I don't see the Lemon Twigs as algorithm rock like I'm talking about with the Crownlands. But Lemon Twigs is definitely a band that leans into nostalgia of a very specific time frame. They make themselves an amalgam of lots of different styles, but of that sort of psychedelic, easy listening genre. I mean, the references to Simon and Garfunkel and the Beach Boys, like Pet Sounds area, the Beatles, and even sometimes Big Star, they're really, really clear. But the clear respect and the connection they have with these bands comes through in the creativity and passion that they've captured on this album. And then the result is this masterfully nostalgic recording that sort of belies the young age of the artist. These guys really are barely even 30 years old, and they're doing amazing, amazing things with this style of music. They're beautifully arranged, they're harmonically masterful, the production is pristine, the songs are singable, the melodies are earworms that will follow you around, even with a song that has one line for the entire song. Every day is the worst day of my life. That's the only lyric to the song. I just taught all the lyrics to you. But it never seems to get old. It goes through all these kind of like a rondo arrangements where this builds and it goes back to the same thing. There's a variation, it goes back to the same thing. Brilliantly arranged, and it does not feel like, unless you look closely, it's repetitive at all. I could argue that the two power pop songs in this album, What You're Doing and Ghost Run Free, are a bit incongruous when you talk about sort of the smooth, yacht rocky feel of the rest of the album. But even they have moments that really contribute strongly to the overall album flow, the experience of the album. And there are many reasons, I think, why this Lemon Twigs album should be the album of the year for me, as probably these last 2 or 3 could have been. They were all considered at one point in time. I mean, in the micro, not only do I love it, but also my family loves it. It's accessible enough that everybody in the family has learned all these songs. We all sing along with them. My kids love these songs. It's kind of funny to hear them sing some of these kind of dark, melancholic lyrics, but you can't deny the lure of these melodies. Also in the macro, you know, the last couple of years I've had more experimental music with Promises from Floating Points, and last year was Low. This year it seems like it would be a good year to kind of get back to something a little more accessible, but my #1 album that actually went out this year with a lot of careful deliberation was Steven Wilson's The Harmony Codex.
God willing, we'll get through this.
After much deliberation and focused listening and comparison and mapping things out album to album, I think that The Harmony Codex is a pretty clear winner. It really wins out on 5 points total. Okay, #1, the album is conceived as sort of this self-encapsulated cinematic listening experience. And you could say the Lemon Twigs are cinematic in their own way, but it's really an album that's intended to be listened to from beginning to end, top to bottom, and has an overarching concept that binds it together. Also requires several different modes of listening. Like, okay, with Lemon Twigs, you're listening to it like a power pop album for the most part, but this one is a progressive rock album. It's a jazz fusion album at times. It has passages that are ambient, has passages that sound like it could have come out of a 70s synthesizer experimentation like Tangerine Dream. It has spoken word sections that sound like the best work of M83, and it's got some rocking sections in there that sound like could have come off of Rush's Hemispheres. And although I'm using all these points of reference for the album, really it stands outside of genre in many ways. It doesn't have any very clear reference. You'll notice the diversity of references I've had to use there to talk about it. Really gives you the indication this is something different. And that was completely Steven Wilson's intention when he was making this album. Now, aside from all this other aspects of the album that I think are brilliant, the production of the album is a feat. Steven Wilson has made a pretty strong side hustle for himself by remixing classic progressive rock albums in Atmos stereo. And his mastery of the system, as well as his experimentation and his knowledge now of all this stuff, has really paid off. And many of the performances that you see Steven Wilson doing of this album at this point are not him playing live with the band, but instead doing surround immersive sound Atmos style performances of this album. And many people are walking away from it, they're like, thinking it was a transformational experience. So there's something to be said for just the way that the album is produced, his pristine ear. And finally, if you want to talk about it in the macro, Steven Wilson has been on my top 20 list. Every year he's put out a solo album. And unless you include the kind of postscript album of the year that I gave him for In Absentia for a little while back, he's never really made album of the year for me. So if anyone has earned a spot at album of the year, I think Steven Wilson has, as far as I'm concerned. And I also think this is really kind of one of my favorite albums of his. I could poke holes in all those previous albums. Even his most masterful work has this sense of being derivative that you could poke a little bit of a hole in. This is not the case with the Harmony Codex. It's a fantastic album that really pushes boundaries and well worth your time, and one that I think I could probably listen to every day for the next year and still find new things out about it. I really don't want to put it away, even though I'm at the end of the year. I'm going to continue listening to this, I think, for a while, pulling more layers off of it. So well done, Stephen Wilson. Album of the Year 2023. And that's all I got for you guys this year. And I really appreciate those of you guys that came around and followed me along for the ride. I hope I got you into some new music. And I'm looking forward to next year. Keep in touch next week because I'll be putting up my Viewer's Choice Top 20 list and a subsequent roundtable review of some participants in that who will sit down and we'll talk about some of that stuff. So if you want to know what's going to happen, please like and subscribe and share the video out with your friends. Follow me over on Spotify. I've got lists that represent all this music. And then hook up with me on Patreon if you want to get involved in next year's Viewer's Choice. And until I see you next time, I'll catch you on the flip side.